I think is really important when you're getting into this business, particularly right now with this advent of Gen AI. If you're looking at wanting to pursue a company or work for a company because it's Gen AI and we're just in this incredible moment of innovation, being able to suss out, are they building tech for the sake of tech? Are they building tech to solve a business problem? And I think the latter is critical in terms of being a company that has staying power and can endure.
One of the hardest things in business is leading a mission-driven company through a moment when the market turns against you. What does it mean to build a high-integrity company? I mean integrity, not just keeping your word, but I mean it in the sense of structural integrity. A company that has the fortitude, the commitment, the character to stay true to its mission even if external forces turn against it. For all the talk about being contrarian in business, unfortunately, very few companies have integrity. So for today's episode of The Eric Ries Show, I wanted to talk to Maria Colacurcio, the CEO of Syndio, a company helping hundreds of major employers from Nordstrom to Salesforce tackle pay equity with data, not politics. In this episode, Maria pulls back the curtain on what it's like to lead a mission-driven company at a time when DEI is under fire. We explore how performance reviews often hide mediocrity, how companies can align their compensation practices with their actual values, and why pay equity isn't about quotas, but rather about consistency, clarity, and accountability. Maria also shares what she learned working under Howard Schultz at Starbucks, how she unexpectedly became a CEO, and why the companies that win long-term are the ones that treat people fairly, even, or I would say especially even, when they don't have to. If you're a founder, exec, or builder trying to scale a company with integrity, I think you're going to take something special away from this episode. Practical lessons on leadership, organizational design, and the power of building trust through transparency. Hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Maria Colacurcio. First of all, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be connected.
When I was thinking about doing this interview, I just could not stop thinking about what it must be like to be running a pay equity company in this cultural and political moment when there's this like unbelievable backlash against all things, quote unquote woke. What's it been like?
It's an interesting and great question. And we're hearing questions over and over again from our customers as well, because I think the biggest thing with this onslaught of executive orders is that it's created this environment of confusion and chaos. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just the executive order on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that one was quite expected, actually, because if you think about the decade plus that the DEI industry has been around, there's been some really good practices that have been pushed forward from that industry, but there's also been some overreach. So anyone that's worked in a corporation has experienced the way that good intention or well-intentioned DEI practices can be rolled down to the front line and then interpreted as quotas. And so I think there was a strong element of expectation around that being rolled back and sort of getting back to this notion of not favoring or disfavoring any particular group when it comes to hiring and promoting and paying and things of that nature. So I don't know that the executive order on DEI was terribly unexpected, and it still sits within that framework of being anti-discriminatory as a company in your practices. What I think was unexpected was the dismantling of the OFCCP. I think was a little bit unexpected for some federal contractors because that's the rollback of any sort of affirmative action programs. And then lastly, I think the termination of 2 EEOC commissioners who still had, 2-ish years left in their term, that was a bit unexpected. So I think there's a bunch of things here that all together combined are just creating a little bit of uncertainty for corporations. What I like to tell folks is that illegal discrimination, unlawful discrimination is still unlawful. And Title VII, when we think about equal pay for equal work, still remains as law. And that's something that corporations still must abide by. And so when you think about not favoring or disfavoring any particular group when it comes to hiring a person because they look like X, you also can't pay them less for those reasons. So I think a lot of the safeguards that we've had in place for a long time as a software company, we've come from that place of not favoring or disfavoring. And so we dug into our data a little bit to sort of help combat and put folks' mind at ease, and found that actually amongst the times our customers have remediated, so made pay remediation in the cases where they did find disparity because of gender or race, 1 out of 5 times those remediations were made on behalf of white men. So what that means is you are uncovering moments where you have disparities in both directions. Now, the flip side is 4 out of 5 times it's in favor of women. But the fact remains that you have to be anti-discriminatory in how you pay. So I think for us, it's been an education journey to make sure folks understand, what does this mean? What does the law still say? And how do I communicate that with potentially my executive team who's kind of running a little bit in fear and confusion mode?
This episode is brought to you by Vanta. If you're a startup founder, then product market fit is obviously your number one priority. But to land bigger customers, you also need security compliance. And obtaining your SOC 2 or ISO 27001 certification can open those big doors. But they take time and energy, pulling you away from building and shipping. That's where Vanta comes in. Vanta is the all-in-one compliance solution helping startups get audit ready and build a strong security foundation quickly and painlessly. Through the platform, access trusted experts to build your program, auditors to get you through audits quickly, and a marketplace for essentials like pen testing. So, whether you're closing your first deal or gearing up for growth, Vanta makes compliance easy. Join over 8,000 companies, including many Y Combinator and Techstars startups who trust Vanta. Simplify compliance and get $1,000 off at vanta.com/Eric. That's VANTA.com/Eric. This episode is brought to you by my friends at Wilson Sonsini, the innovation economies law firm. From the earliest days of the semiconductor industry to today's fast-advancing AI sector, not to mention healthcare and life sciences, Wilson Sonsini has represented the pioneers behind nearly every technology breakthrough. Based in Silicon Valley, Wilson Sonsini is connected to the top minds and institutions that inspire discovery and innovation, with strong ties to leading venture capital firms and investors in key markets, from Silicon Valley to New York and London and beyond. In fact, Wilson Sonsini is consistently top-ranked for the number of venture financings it handles each year. For more information, visit ecbc.wsgr.com.
You talked about the positive things that have come out of DEI, but also what you called overreach. Can you just give some examples of what you view as like the good and the bad of this, decade plus of DEI?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the intention is good in terms of opportunity equity. That's something we talk about a lot in terms of expanding that pool of opportunity. If you think about your qualified applicant pool and thinking about, I want to expand my qualified applicant pool so that I'm hiring in multiple states and giving opportune advantages for lots of people that come from different backgrounds and different experiences. I think that is generally positive. I think what happens though sometimes is there'll be a policy or something set in place at the higher levels in a company. And by the time it rolls down all the way to the front line to managers that are doing the hiring, to managers that are having to articulate what they want in a particular team member, sometimes that articulation of a very well-intentioned policy comes out sounding like a quota. Well, we've got to fill this seat with a woman. We've got to fill this seat with a person that looks like this or has this background or experience. And I think that's been sort of the negative outcome and or overreach. And I don't know that it was particularly poorly intentioned. I don't think that's what people were trying to do. I think at the outset, it was about expanding opportunity. And I think that's very positive.
Why is it so important to expand opportunity?
I think it's important for a variety of reasons, but I think what companies and what our customers are really trying to do is think about, if you think about the metrics, for example, that drive some of these conversations, there's pay equity, which is reflected in equal pay for equal work. So cents on the dollar, pay inequity, pay equity. And then there's something called the median pay gap. A lot of times in the news, those things are conflated. So when you think of pay equity, you're thinking of the gap, but it's actually different. And so when you think of the pay gap, that's a reflection of representation. So if you think about, all your men are up here in your higher paying roles and all your women are down here, that would be a large pay gap. So one of the things we think about when we think about opportunity equity is, how are people moving up? What does that movement, that ladder look like? And do you have broken rungs that you could potentially identify fixes for in an anti-discriminatory way? So how do you make sure that people have opportunity to move up, that you're identifying where your top talent is and making sure there aren't obstacles in their way that shouldn't be there? Because the fact of the matter is, when you look at things like performance reviews, when you analyze those, because that's something that our software also does, there's bias in performance reviews. There's a lot of discretion in how people are rated provided. There's a lot of discretion in the rating or the review, both in the qualitative, but also in the quantitative metrics. And we've seen that over and over again when we analyze these ratings. So I think, that opportunity equity just makes sure that you're applying agnostic software to identify where you've got some issues and where mediocrity is lurking, so you can sort of ferret that out and make sure your top performers are the ones moving up, and that everyone has those opportunities if they're meeting the qualifications and exceeding expectations in terms of driving value.
Yeah, that was one thing I find really fascinating in all these debates about diversity and meritocracy, is that you often hear critics say that, they don't want to lower their standards in order to have a more diverse workforce. Yet, if you look at the research about how performance reviews are done, I like the way you said it. There's mediocrity lurking, because when someone's giving it was honestly a false performance review based on their affinity with the person rather than based on their performance. That's actually how we wind up with so many mediocre managers. And it's funny to me that the same people who rail against these policies are also the people railing against all the mediocre managers in their own companies, and how they have to go founder mode to, purge all those people. And I always think to myself, well, how did those people get hired and promoted in the first place? Maybe we should take a look at that. So what do you think is the link between performance and pay equity, or any of these kind of fairness policies that are so much being criticized these days?
Yeah, I think the important thing is that you're analyzing it, that you're actually looking at it. And this is just math. This isn't any sort of magic formula that creates bias or that inserts some sort of favoritism to underrepresented groups. This is just looking at the policies for which a company says they pay. And again, this goes back to, it's not unlawful to pay people differently. You just have to have a stated philosophy on what the company values. And I think this is where we're taking our technology, the direction that we're seeing our customers drive us in, because we love listening to our customers and we derive some of our innovation from their ideas. And about a year ago, we released a solution called consistency analytics. And what this does is it looks agnostic of gender or race, just at your policies. And are your policies actually matching your pay decisions that are happening on the ground? So when you get those policies reflected back, are you paying for the things you say you value? And typically, you're always going to have outliers. But if you have clusters of outliers that are high and low, you can identify, do we need to memorialize a pay policy around this? So it's not always an exception. It's actually aligned to what we value and what we value as a company in terms of driving business outcomes. And then make sure that we're recommending those things every time a new pay, promotion, or lateral transfer offer is being done. And when companies do that and they're super consistent, so pay consistency ultimately is the path to pay equity. Then what happens is you just have to do a spot check every now and then to make sure you're on the right track. We're seeing companies really pushing toward this direction of pay consistency, also because of the legislative compliance and regulatory environment that's requiring more and more disclosures about why you pay what you pay. And that's happening big time in the jurisdictions of the EU with the EU Pay Transparency Directive, but we're also seeing states pick up on those words and insert them into state pay transparency laws.
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad you go there, because what I think is really fascinating about this is there's kind of two rationales you hear for people confronting these issues. And there's one, which is this kind of statutory requirement. Look, the world is moving in a certain direction, and, there's going to be these rules. You have this, jurisdictions that are imposing penalties on companies that don't do it. And that makes sense. But then I kind of feel like when we have a moment of backlash against that policy regime, people sometimes say, oh, well, there's not going to be enforcement of those rules anymore. Or, they have a kind of easily can convince themselves that they're not going to be forced to do it. But what's so interesting to me, and the thing I'm interested in more than the statutory policy side, not that that's not important, but there's other people a lot more expert in it than me. The thing I find it particularly interesting is the idea of creating consistency in terms of what the company actually believes and values. Because one of the most important things that I found in my own research is companies that achieve coherence, like where they actually do what they say they're going to do, are the only ones that are able to build trust. You can't be trustworthy if your customers can't believe anything that you say. But that's also true with your own employees. If you say that these are our values, but you promote on the basis of different values, it doesn't really have to be a gender race thing at all. It doesn't, you say you value performance, but you promote mediocrity. It doesn't really matter why. Like, is it bias? Is it systemic racism? Or is it just incompetence? Nobody cares. What really matters is, are you in fact aligned? And of course, performance is one of the easier ones to quantify, companies also have these other values. They talk about being long-term. They talk about caring for their community. They talk about putting the customer first. They talk about being strategic. And so I could name so many things that people have told me that their company values. And one of my first questions is, how does anyone know? People who work here, how do they know that that's what you value? And they're like, well, we put it up on a poster on the wall. It's like, yeah, but people hear with their ears. That's true. But they also hear with their wallet. Is that you consistently promote? Do you allocate resources on the basis of those values? And so to me, it's like there's like these two dueling narratives about fairness or about integrity. And the question is like, do we do it because we have to do it, because it's a policy that requires it? Or like freed of that obligation, is this what we ought to want? Is there a performance benefit? Are we going to be a better long-term corporation because we can attract and retain the best talent, because we can build up trust and be consistent in the way that we work? And I'm curious if you find that, especially in a moment like this, where the policy rationale is so much under attack, are companies coming around to this second way of thinking?
Absolutely. I mean, and I think what we see is pay equity grows when merit is ignored. So to your point, you as a company have to match your compensation intent with reality. And that's where we see the biggest gap that we're trying to solve, which are your pay philosophies, which drive value for your business and should be nimble and agile and flexing and ever changing, just like the macro and micro environments are. And then the decisions that are being executed by your people managers, your HR business partners, your recruiters, your folks that are executing against those promotions and setting pay for promotions or transferring people laterally. You have to have articulation of the policies for every single one of those pay decisions. And when there's discretion, you're always going to have discretion. But the more discretion you have, you're going to insert the most opportunity for things that champion mediocrity. Because if you're benefiting or rewarding things like they're a great negotiator, or they're overconfident, or they're my pal, or they're, I know that they have a toxic environment over there, so I'm going to move them over here, or they're underperforming. So it's that typical
Just to name some hypothetical things.
Yeah, dance of the lemon, we're going to move them over here because we're not, those sorts of things. If you're making pay decisions based on those things, that's just as bad. You're going to reward mediocrity. You're going to have mediocrity everywhere in your company. And so again, being really clear about, we don't judge as a software company what you choose to value as a company. It could be tenure, education. It could be your performance scores. It could be, we just want anyone that has data science expertise because we are going all in with AI. It could be any of those things, but memorialize that policy and then push that through recommendations for pay at every moment in the decision cycle. And what we find is when our customers do this and they have that range within which to stay that aligns with their policies, all it takes is that little nudge to sort of snap someone out of total discretion. So if they get a nudge and they're about to give someone a promotion, an off-cycle promotion, and that person is threatening to leave. We've all been in this situation, right? They're threatening to leave. So we're going to do this off-cycle promotion because it's our Hail Mary. We're going to keep them. But 6 out of 7 times within 3 months, that person's going to leave anyway. So you're flushing money down the toilet. They just get a little nudge, which is, hey, we see you're about to do an off-cycle promotion. We recommend staying within this tight range because just FYI, the last 50,000 times you've done this, they've left within 3 months. So are you sure you want to do it? They may press forward and do it, but at least that little nudge can guide discretion to keep that increase to a lower amount in accordance with the policies and what they've seen to work in the past. And those are all of the things that are possible when you're able to collect data in critical moments of decision making and then loop that back to make better and better decisions in the future.
One more question about the macro environment, because I agree with you that certain things that are going on in the culture now are relatively expected. And I think some of them certainly can be attributed to overreach. I think we all have friends and colleagues who have worked inside large bureaucracies, especially in academia or in a knowledge work big company where, some DEI policy has run amok and they felt really stressed about it. And, I've heard all the same horror stories everyone else has heard about bad DEI trainings or ineffective stuff people have tried. So I kind of expected that there would be a certain like white collar pushback against that. It makes sense. What I didn't really foresee is how upset these CEOs have been. Like I knew there was a certain set of CEOs who were very vocal and anti-woke and kind of upset about it, but you really see this like sense of liberation that a large number of CEOs have had, where it's just like finally they can like push back against their employees. And I was watching an interview recently. I think it was actually with a journalist who was recounting what a bunch of CEOs had told her, and she was like, very interesting. She's like, well, what did they expect? They coddled these employees and told them they were God's gift and gave them free lunch and all this other stuff. So of course they became entitled. And of course they started doing activism or whatever. And like really interesting to me, like locating the blame for this scenario in the employees rather than in the CEOs who hired them. And I'm just curious, what do you make of this kind of rebellion at the top that people have been feeling like they were under some kind of a constraint that was unfair, that this really seemed like it was bothering them and they didn't feel comfortable saying anything about it. And now they feel really liberated to go after it, where like, obviously not all companies are doing that. It's been a very, very particular set of CEOs, but they have been very vocal. And I just wonder what you make about it.
I think the cycles repeat. And I think it just depends how old you are. I'm old enough that I worked through the tech boom and bust. And I think we saw something very similar. I think when you've got these, in that cycle, it was leaders feeling very resentful that they were being held over a barrel for this high cost developer talent and the big initial swell of engineers. And then when that became less of a scarce resource, when it became more commoditized, just developers in general, front end, back end, whatever you want to call it, there was this sense of sort of like, aha, now I gotcha. Now I can put you in your place and I don't have to pay these exorbitant salaries to you. And you're going to be so much less entitled. And I'm going to put it's sort of that put you in your place mindset. I think you see these cycles and they kind of come and go with labor markets, and they come and go with talent that is scarce and highly, highly sought after, and therefore the prices get driven up. And I think people then express sort of this resentment or something when it comes back full circle, and they can sort of compress those salaries back down to where they think they ought to be. I don't know. I think it's quite interesting, but I think we've seen this before.
Yeah, the cycle, it definitely is cyclical, and we do go through these moments. And I think it's a really interesting bit of career advice, and I'm curious how you think about this. One thing I've noticed when counseling people in their careers, people want to go work at a good company. That's like a very common thing. They want, especially if you have a scarce talent and you have an engineering, or like think about people who are skilled in AI right now, really have their choice of where to work. They want to work somewhere that's consistent with their values, that's going to support them long term. And increasingly, I hear people saying things like, I want to go work at a place where they're going to treat me well, even when they don't have to. And what I think is really interesting about that cycle is it's so revealing. It's like people basically like treating people fairly, like because I have to, builds up my resentment. And like the first opportunity, as soon as I can undo that and like get them back, but as you say, put them in their place, I'm psyched to do that. And people often ask me during the boom times, how do I avoid that happening to me? Like, what are the signs I should look for a company that is actually sincerely committed to its values and policies and aren't just going to betray them the first available opportunity? And I know you guys have done a lot of work with trying to figure out like, how do we certify or kind of give companies that are sincerely committed to these ideas a way to signal that so that they can reap the reward of attracting talent who will trust them to live that consistency day to day?
It's a great question. And I'm glad you're being asked that question from folks young in their career, because it's so important. And when anyone asks me that question, I always tell them in the interview process, there are a couple of questions you can ask about. Do you run pay equity analyses? Do you identify whether you have pay gaps that are because of something like gender? And if the answer is we don't know or we can't tell you that, then that's a red flag. Because the customers that we deal with, by and large, are very proud of the fact that they're committed to these topics, and they're still committed to these topics, even amidst all of this chaos and confusion. And they're committed to the topics because for many of them, it's a competitive advantage when they're in the recruiting conversation with someone. So when you think about a customer like Elevance Health, who pushes out our recommendations to hundreds of their recruiters. So their recruiters see the market range, and then they see what's called the equitable range, meaning what is someone who currently works in your company with the same skills and experiences that you're about to hire someone new. They share those. What do they make? And what is the range within which you need to stay in order to stay competitive, but also fair? And what's really interesting about how that product has been rolled out and how they use it is it's given these recruiters so much decision confidence. This is a term they used. It's given us decision confidence because now we can tell the candidate with confidence that they are not only going to be paid competitively, they're also going to be paid fairly. And what that means is when we go to hire the next 100 people after they're in seat, they're not going to see new people coming in at exorbitantly higher rates than what they were hired at, because we keep that in mind as we continue to grow. And They've seen just remarkable acceleration in not only their acceptance rates have gone up, but also their time to fill has accelerated. And they attribute it to having this information and this decision confidence that they can articulate. This is what it means to be a place that's fair and consistent with our policies.
I think that's a really good segue into just what is Syndio? And, maybe before we get into kind of the company, the history of the company, let's talk a little bit about your history. Like, you're the CEO now, but you're not the company's original founder. I was reading online, as I was doing my research for this, you had a kind of an interesting path coming into the technology industry. You don't fit the kind of classic story of typical tech founder, but you have started tech companies. You have, I remember Smartsheets in particular. I want to hear about that. And I want to hear kind of how did you get inspired to kind of come into the technology industry from a different background, and maybe kind of catch us up. How did you wind up in this seat after that path?
Sure. It's very random and nonlinear. But it all worked out as it was supposed to. And I agree. So it's very rare to find, particularly in B2B, a CEO that is a marketer or communications as their background. You typically see like the engineering folks are the ones that found the companies or grow into that seat of CEO. And I always was curious as to what it would be like to work for a communications oriented CEO, particularly after spending the time working at Starbucks HQ under Howard Schultz, because he is just the master of communications. He's so incredibly articulate and visionary when it comes to motivating people through the use of language. I mean, at the end of the day, as a leader, you have language and you have time. Those are the two things you have. You have your words and you have how you choose to spend your time. And he was just masterful at both. And it didn't occur to me that it would be me. So it was just a very sort of windy path. I never set out to be a tech CEO. I started as a history major. I moved to DC to work at the Smithsonian, at the National Museum of American History, and was sort of a grunty intern doing deep research on history topics to support the curation team when they lost somebody who was helping develop this entire event series around the Middle Passage. And so they pulled me out of my hole wherever I was doing my deep research. And after it was over, after I had spent, a quarter, 3 or 4 months doing these series of events, I was so naive that I asked the woman who ran the department, I said, what do you call all that work I was just doing? And she said, well, it was, marketing, communications, event planning. And I was like, that was amazing. That was so much fun. It fit my personality so much better than being sort of this deep history rat who was, and all the respect to those folks. But it was a very, very different sort of environment that I loved. And so I started doing work like that. I started working for nonprofits. I worked for an agency that supported nonprofits. And I met a woman at a dinner party. This is sort of tech boom time. And she said, you got to come to Silicon Valley. It's where it's at. Come interview for my company. And I did. I figured, why not? And I think it's sort of that incredibly privileged, laissez-faire attitude that I had in those ages of like, why not? Why not try it? And that really comes from having parents that never went to college, but that were incredibly supportive of making sure we all got an education. My grandparents immigrated from Italy. My dad ran strip clubs and played poker for a living, but he was always so incredibly determined to get us 4 kids through college. And I think that led me to have this resiliency and privilege of just feeling like I could take risks. And I don't think everyone has that ability. So I did it. I went and
Why was it important for him that you go to college?
He never went to college, and he always said, he still says to this day, that it's his biggest regret. He actually missed school. He went to a public school. His parents were farmers. They were truck farmers. So they grew produce and trucked it over to Pike Place Market. And it was a particularly busy time of year. So he missed school the day they were doing, at that time, they just did blanket college admission tests. And he missed that day. And a bunch of his friends who were, similar level to him in terms of intellectual capability. So he says, this is all, from him. They all went on to go to the UW and had a very different sort of career path and journey than what he had. And I think he regretted that, still does. So he made it sort of his life's goal that we would all get an education. And that was very, very important to him. And I think that just set, when when you see that, when you feel that type of support, even though I didn't have the monetary support or the network that some of my friends did, it's just this intrinsic support that is so rare and so important, that gives you the ability to think like, I'll take a risk because I may fall down from a financial perspective, but I can also always get a job as a waitress, or it's sort of this like land on my feet mentality. You don't have a safety net in terms of dollars, but you have a safety net in terms of the mental resilience to know that you can figure it out. And I just think that is incredibly, incredibly rare and valuable.
No, it is a kind of social capital as real as financial capital. And yeah, I think that psychology is also a kind of, I mean, you called it a privilege, but I think that is really true. Like it opens up so many doors to people who are willing to take that leap. What was the company that brought you out to Silicon Valley?
So it was called Remediations. I have such fond memories, but it was hardware software. It was an Israeli-based startup. All the guys were former.
You're dating yourself for sure.
I totally am.
I remember. I remember that one.
Yeah, former military. And my job was basically to go into the tech room, like the room with all the boxes and servers, and talk to all these Israeli engineers and try to figure out, how do I translate what they're talking about to the sales guys? And I mean, it really was guys. It was a bunch of guys, all everywhere, guys.
Everywhere, yeah.
And so that, it's core product marketing, but figuring out like, how do you translate the value of what they're building into something that can resonate with the buyer and create product market fit and have urgency and all of that. And that was my first job. And eventually it was acquired and I moved back up to Seattle, which is home, and worked for Onyx Software and Microsoft, and ultimately co-founded Smartsheet. But that was really my first foray into tech. And I really loved it. I loved it. I enjoyed the challenge of trying to figure out and ask a million questions about what we were doing and why it had value. And it also gave me an ability to sort of flesh out tech for the sake of tech, which I think is really important when you're getting into this business, particularly right now with this advent of Gen AI. If you're looking at wanting to pursue a company or work for a company because it's Gen AI and we're just in this incredible moment of innovation, being able to suss out, are they building tech for the sake of tech? Are they building tech to solve a business problem? And I think the latter is critical in terms of being a company that has staying power and can endure.
Give me an example. Do you have a favorite one of how you illustrate? I'm sure you've had to explain this concept to your own teams and to people you've mentored. I mean, I have had that challenge myself. Like, do you have a favorite example you like to use to illustrate, tech for solving a problem versus tech for tech's sake?
Yeah, I think we struggled with it a little bit in the early days of Smartsheet because it was so ubiquitous. We were creating something to us that we were solving a really specific business problem, which was the business problem we experienced at Onyx. You're in a meeting and you're all going around and doing your status updates. And then the next week you sort of do it again, but all these balls have been dropped and no one knows where anything stands. And you want sort of a single source of truth that everyone can be involved in and share so that you can make more value out of your meetings. But when you go to apply that problem to the market, when we started, it was sort of like, it's going to solve every problem for everyone. And I think that was really problematic when we first started because we didn't necessarily know who's our buyer, what problem are we solving. It was kind of like, well, we'll build templates. We'll sell this to event planners and for applicant tracking and for CRM and for task planning. It was sort of everything for everyone. And we had to kind of get really specific and smart about the use cases because what was happening is we were making this promise in a broad way in our landing pages and our marketing, and it was working. But then people came into the software and they didn't have that bespoke experience that solved their problem. It was very generic. And so I think you have to be really mindful of who are you solving the problem for? And then how do you translate that promise into the actual software to make sure they have that experience that they're solving this problem for me? So at Syndio, I was very, because when I joined, Zev the original founder had raised a seed round and bought an organizational network analysis piece of software. And so we had that. And then we also were starting the pay equity business. And one of the first things that I did as CEO, hand in hand with him as the co-founder, was we've got to pick one. Because there is no way with a team of 6 people that we can make this promise, sure, but actually fulfill this promise to both audiences in terms of the problem we're trying to solve, unless we want to do it in a really generic way. And I had learned that that's troublesome when you're first starting out.
In the classic Crossing the Chasm by Jeff Moore, he actually has like a little aside. There's a whole section on what he calls platform disease, where engineers get so enamored with the general purpose platform that is like out of the box can solve 80% of any problem you want, that they never get around to solving 100% of any particular problem, without which, of course, you can never cross the chasm. And I remember reading that and it was like a dagger to my heart. I was just like, oh yeah, guilty as charged. I've definitely 100% done that. And yeah, I think that's like very, very classic in kind of pivot stories is people first are like, why not both? Why can't we do the old thing and the new thing? And when you're a small team, the answer really is you have to focus. If you don't focus, you're not gonna learn. You're gonna be distracted by those possibilities.
Yeah.
So like, tell us how you became a founder. Like, what was it like to kind of, I feel like being in the tech industry is fun. There's people who go their whole careers just going from one exec job to another. You don't really understand what's going on in the tech industry till you become a founder yourself. Like, what was that like, that transition into being a founder? Like, why did you do it, and how was it different maybe than what you were expecting?
It was so different when I would say this founding story of Smartsheet versus Syndio. And I would say Syndio, even though Zev had co-founded a company and raised a seed to purchase the technology, when I joined with Rob Porcarelli, who was the head of global employment law at Starbucks, we were kind of innovating and hatching a plan to create something similar when we found Zev. So I would say when we joined forces with Zev, it was very much that same kind of founder experience with the three of us sort of, again, choosing to go in one direction and really focus on the pay equity technology that Zev had been thinking about as well. And I would say those experiences were so different because with Smartsheet, there were three of us and I was the least experienced of the three. And so it was just such a learning experience in terms of sitting side saddle and kind of being the marketing and communication voice as part of. So if you think about when we were raising our Series A, I had my presentation on pipe gen and how we were going to go attack the market and create this category. It was super exciting, but I wasn't the one in the lead seat feeling the pain of the 50 no's. Of course I was feeling the pain, but I wasn't the one having to devise the whole business plan and the numbers. I was inputting to it. And the only thing I can say is being an input to a plan and being the tip of the spear for a plan is just very, very different. And so my experience with Syndio is, it sort of succeeds or dies with me. The buck stops with me. And that's very empowering and exciting. And it's also tremendously stressful.
No one else to blame.
It's kind of the, success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. I think that is the quote for any person that's pursuing the entrepreneurial journey. And you really have to welcome that. Like I always, one of my executives said something one time where they said, the best light is reflected light. When you see that you've successfully scaled and you have a lieutenant or a leader that's coming up that's actually leading and that light is being reflected back on you because they're performing. Is there anything better as an entrepreneur? Because your scale is the only thing that matters is scale. Because in the beginning, you're doing it all. And if you can't make that leap from doing it all yourself to starting to scale a team, you're dead in the water. You're just dead in the water.
Talk a little bit about your time at Starbucks, because I think sounds like that's where you kind of, not like maybe hatched the scheme is a little too much, but like had the insight that would ultimately lead to you wanting to take Syndio in this new direction when you did join. So just, like you talked about Howard Schultz and what an incredible communicator he was. I want to know if you ever heard him talk about the reservoir of trust.
Yes.
And so can you explain the reservoir of trust for our listeners?
Oh my gosh, the reservoir of trust and crucible moments and just everything about respect and dignity. The reservoir of trust is this notion that no matter what position you're in terms of your employee experience, you are treating people as a leader with respect and dignity. And those two words were used all the time in a way that was so authentic. And even now as a mentor, he indulges me and lets me have moments with him, 30-minute calls or whatever when I need them, which is, again, just a huge leg up. But every time I talk to him, I'm just still struck by the fact that his advice, even in a one-on-one setting, is about respect and dignity. And if you're going to have to do these things, how are you thinking about treating everyone respectfully and in a dignified manner as you move through the motions of what the business needs? And it's remarkable. It's a remarkable authenticity.
I've heard this story like second, third hand from so many people who he's touched. And what always strikes me about the reservoir of trust is the extent to which it's both a moral claim that you should do this thing, but it's also a matter of strategy. It's like you will get this trustworthiness advantage if you build this asset, step by step, brick by brick. And I wonder, like, do you feel like that to me seems like it has such direct parallels to what you're trying to do at Syndio? Like, is that a connection you draw on as you're thinking about it?
Yes. And his question that he posed often, which is, what is the role and responsibility of a private company? And it's those two role, but responsibility. What is the responsibility? And that says that you're there to do more than just drive profit, which I think was absolutely key. And so the experience that I had at Starbucks was I was on the communications team and we were preparing for his last annual meeting before Kevin Johnson took over. And we were going to announce our pay parity, our cents on the dollar, which no one was doing at the time. This is pre-pay transparency, pre-everything. And I think we were 98 cents on the dollar. And so as a overly eager, ambitious, naive comms person, I was like, I want it to be dollar for dollar. This is so important. And so I went to Rob, who is the head of global employment law, and he managed all of the pay equity efforts under lock and key, with outside counsel, underprivileged, the whole thing, the industry that we ultimately disrupted. And I said, why can't this be dollar for dollar? We really need it to be dollar for dollar. And he's like, that's nice, kid, that you want it to be dollar for dollar, but it's not. And he was very patient in that he took me through and educated me on what does it mean to do a pay equity analysis. You send out your data, they spend 6 months looking at it, they send you back this 150-page crosstab report with who to pay and how much to get out of legal risk. And I looked at him, I said, we need to create a startup for this. I'm like, this is so obvious. Like, we can absolutely make this process more efficient, better. We can learn about like what policies are driving these issues so we can fix them. Because the way he described it, we were going to spend 6 months to get this report. By the time we got it, everything was going to have changed and we were going to have to do it again 6 months later. It just seemed ridiculous. And so he was like, that's not how it works. And I said, that's exactly how it works. So we started kind of doing the thing, where we were getting some developers and talking about this and trying to think about it. And that's when he found Zev. Zev was actually pitching Starbucks to try to get them hooked on the O&A solution. And he talked about, and on the side, I'm working on this pay equity idea. And Rob, called me up and was like, someone invented our thing. And I was like, no, it's probably fine. It's probably fine. Like, let's go talk to him. Anyway, long story short, we ended up joining forces. And, now here we are 7 years later with 350 customers. But I think it really, again, was a testament to the power of curiosity, the power of asking more questions than just accepting, okay, 98 cents on the dollar. That's what I'm going to work on. I'm going to figure out a messaging plan and talking points around this. That would be a very normal path. But just continuing to have that relentlessness of, I want it to be better. I'm going to figure out and ask questions as to how we got from point A to point B. That's really what unlocked, the rest of it, in terms of where we are at now with Syndio.
This episode is brought to you by Gusto. I'm a huge fan of Gusto. I've used the product myself across many companies, many startups, large, small business, venture-backed, you name it. I've used Gusto for payroll, for benefits, for employee onboarding, HR, even small group health insurance for nearly any budget. Best of all, Gusto pays all your federal, state, and local payroll taxes in all 50 states. It turns an incredibly time-consuming and painful process into the click of a button. That's why I like Gusto. Oh, and if you're listening to this, you can get 3 months free at gusto.com/Eric. That's gusto.com/ERIC.
So you decided to leave Starbucks to come to Syndio. Like, just walk us through what that was actually like, because, those of us who've been around startups a long time know the story quite well. Sometimes you have this like very early promising thing, but there's like a missing piece, and just until you get the right team on board, to get the right things together, the right pivot, the right thing, like you can't make it work. And yet from the outside, like I read a bunch of profiles of you and I see how people report the story. And I get the sense from the outside, people are kind of confused about what exactly did happen, who started this company and how did it wind up doing pay equity? Like, it's something that only makes sense to connoisseurs of the startup, it made sense to me, but I could see how people were confused about it. So just like walk us through, like, what was that like? How were those initial conversations? Like, how did you decide ultimately to join forces and take the company in this direction?
Yeah, it was really great. I mean, and that's a testament to Zev. Zev is a PhD JD data scientist, and he's off doing his next startup now. But he knew he wasn't an operational leader. So when we first reached out to Zev and we were like, hey, we have a bunch of ideas. We think this is really interesting what you're doing. And he immediately asked Rob to be on the advisory board. And I said, hey, I would love to just help you out on the side, like with some of the pricing and packaging. I think you've got something really interesting here. And I was talking about the infancy of the pay equity stuff that he had just started thinking about as a side hustle. Because remember, his main gig was the organizational network analysis solution. And it was just like this whisper of a product. I was like, I'm really interested in that, your side hustle. So I want to help you with that. And so I wasn't getting paid or anything. I just was sort of helping him on the side. And I was on maternity leave at the time with my sixth kid. And so I was getting, work done with Zev while I was on maternity leave from Starbucks and just sort of helping him out, like collaborating, doing some ideas on pricing and packaging, helping him out with some go-to-market strategy. And I don't exactly know what he presented to the board because I wasn't in that. But one day after he had a board meeting, one of the board members who is still at my board, and I just absolutely adore him. He was one of the first seed investors, called me up and he was like, we'd like to promote you to head of sales and marketing. And I was like, I don't work here. I was like, I don't work here. I'm just helping out on the side.
I can't be promoted because I don't work here.
Yeah.
You're not even paying me.
This is just for fun. But long story short, they decided to hire a CEO. And so Zev was like, you should throw your hat in the ring for this CEO job. And I was very unsure. I had never been a CEO. Like I said, I had ridden side saddle and grown a company, but I was the head of marketing. I'd never run a company. And so I did. I think there were 45 candidates, and I had the benefit of having kind of a little bit of the inside track in terms of I already had identified that I thought the strategy was to focus on this side hustle product. So I had a lot of benefits, and Zev was super supportive of me, which is just a testament to how much he believes in the mission. And they have still to this day, I actually talked to him today. We have an 89-year-old seed investor. So there were two guys. The first one was the one that promoted me. The other one was this guy. And he turns 89 actually tomorrow. It's his birthday. And I had an interview with him. And he said, my big concern about you, Maria, is you've never run something. Yeah. And then he stopped. There was this long pause. And he said, but I suppose if you never get the opportunity to run something, how will you know to run something? And I was like, it's a great point, Peter. His name's Peter. I adore him. And so those two guys
kind of answers itself. Yeah.
Yeah. Those two guys really, well, the three of them, honestly, Zev, Peter, and Bob just took an absolute chance on me. Like they really took a chance on me. I was untested. I was unproven. But it worked out. I mean, so we've.
Why do you think they did that? I mean, listen, I love the story, and I think it's actually very common for founders in particular to have an affinity for the untried, unproven, high potential candidate, and then usually they run into interference because it makes sense. Like founders often are unqualified for the job they get when they found a company, so they can totally relate to hiring somebody else based on their potential, not based on their credentials or their past experience or whatever. And I think we've all kind of lived through. Sometimes the person who looks the best on paper, who's the most experienced, or whatever, is actually the most like hidebound in their thinking, and is actually not. They got where they are by playing politics or whatever else, and not actually that good at their job. So, but yet most of the time, that founder impulse to do that runs into the buzzsaw of investors and board members and VCs who are just they're sort of just too risk averse for it. So, like, why do you think they made that decision?
We should have them on and ask them. I honestly don't know. They saw something in me. I don't know what that thing was. I think they saw in me just this driven ambition that I wanted to do something and build something, and I was going to put my shoulder to it and wasn't going to quit. Honestly, though, I don't know. There were much, much better candidates than me on paper. There were people that had been in the HCM space that knew HR tech. I didn't know HR tech at all. I mean, I had so much tech experience, but it was in task management, CRM, all sorts of things, but HR tech. And they had some really solid candidates that really knew the space. But I think they knew I was going to dig in and I was going to keep asking questions until I got to know it. But I honestly don't know. I don't know why they gave me the shot. I'm just very, very happy that they did.
Well, from the outside, it seems like it's worked out pretty well for everybody. So talk a little bit about, it's been, that was what, 5, 6 years ago now. It was a little while ago that happened, or longer.
Yes. I joined November of 2018.
Oh yeah. We're coming up on 7 years now.
We're coming up on 7.
Yet another overnight success, 7 years in the making.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, so talk about the pivot, and then just, how did you know it was, like, obviously you knew it was the right thing. You came in, you were hired to do a job, to do the pivot, to take the company in this new direction. So you obviously believed in it, but when did you really know that it was going to work?
Well, the first thing I did was hire Rob. So convince him to, and I think that is a founder entrepreneur's job, is to get great talent and to put them in the right seats. And I think we were extremely successful at doing that in our first couple of years. And Rob had led global employment law at Starbucks for 13 years. And he had been a lawyer prior to that at DWT and other places, came out of the Navy. And so the board was like, what is this lawyer going to do? And I said, he's going to lead sales. And they were like, that's insane. And I said, well, we need the Fortune 50. He knows the Fortune 50. He loves what we're doing. He's willing to trade his credibility on it. And that's unheard of. He's going to be the one that's going to get these companies to take a leap on a very disruptive technology that is completely changing the way these analyses are done. And so I think that was really the clear linchpin to our success the first year or two, where we scaled from 300K. Because remember, we got rid of all that initial, there was about 500K in ARR from the O&A, and we let that all go, which is a very scary thing.
That's hard to do.
And at the end of year one, we ended 2019 at about 2.5 million, and then have continued on a very, very strong trajectory ever since. We have about 320-ish customers now and cover Fortune 2000. So we're selling to enterprise and very, very strong and impressive companies across industries. So I think hiring good talent in those early days and putting them in the right seats is really critical. And then the next critical point is knowing when you need to move from sort of the jack of all trades Swiss Army knife to, like, Rob's a great example. So at what point do you need to hire a sales leader that understands like commissions and territory planning and all that stuff? Because you do. And if you do it too late, you kind of screw yourself. And if you do it too early, you kind of miss some of the magic you could have captured. So finding that sweet spot is really tricky.
I don't know that we've actually talked about what the product does. We've been kind of talking around it and talking about all the benefits that it has to customers. And it just occurred to me, some people may not be familiar. So just talk a little bit about, it started out, with this pivot, it was, came out of the kind of like organizational analysis kind of software. Now you've really specialized in this very discrete pain point that companies that want to be merit-based have. But how does the software actually solve that problem?
Yeah, great question. So you're exactly right. We started out as solving pay equity analyses, which is a very particular analysis that was being run by consultants and law firms. And we moved from that into intelligent pay. So how are you thinking about what are your policies? What do you want your policies to be? So let's help you model your ideal policies. And then how do you push those pay policies through to decision making? So how do you make sure every recommendation, whether it's for starting pay, a new hire, new hire and starting pay, that's the same thing. A new hire, promotion, lateral transfer, or whatever, is reflective of those policies. So it really is a full scale solution that lets you analyze your policies. So see reflections as to where are we doing well, where are we not, where are we actually predicting pay in a way that makes sense. If we say we pay for tenure, our highest tenured people, also our highest paid, where are we falling down on those promises as it relates to reality? And then switching the dials and pushing those recommendations through. And then, of course, we offer still the ability to run the pay equity analysis on top. So make your policies consistent, align those with pay on the ground with the front line, and then run the pay equity analysis spot checks to make sure you're staying true and not creating unlawful disparities because of something like gender or race. And then I would say the latest thing that we've rolled out is a solution to address the EU directive on pay transparency for global companies. So that gives them all the things they need to prepare for the directive, to take action within our software to address 5% gaps ahead of having to report on those 5% gaps, and then pushing through a really clear sort of push button way to do the reports for all the different jurisdictions. And when I say all, pretty much all the jurisdictions that have put out their drafts so far. So there's the directive, which sort of says you have to do these things, these baseline things, but it's really the floor, not the ceiling. And then each jurisdiction comes out with sort of their riff on the directive. So, Sweden is, hundreds of pages. And then you've got Ireland and the UK and Belgium, and they all kind of have their different take on this. So one of the things we just released with AI is something called Syndi, which is exciting because Syndi is our proprietary chatbot that's trained on all of our expertise around these reporting requirements. So for example, if you're a global company and you have employees in Ireland, you could say, Syndi, what's my, I have an employee on parental leave. Do I need to include this employee in the report for blah, blah, blah? Syndi will respond and have the sources. So it's everything companies need to be able to be compliant, but then also be intelligent about how they pay.
How's it going? Give us a sense of just the scale of the company now. I've been at this a few years. Seems like it's been an upward trajectory, but hasn't been a lot of information publicly reported. Where's the company at now?
Yeah, we haven't, I don't know the last time. So we raised our Series C in 2021. It was a $50 million round. We haven't raised since then intentionally, and we will be break even by the end of this year. So that's a huge milestone for us. We wanted to get to profitability. Our retention rates are about 94%. So we have a very, very high retention rate with our customers, which is also very intentional. We're very customer centric and focused in terms of how we service our customers, how we respond to feedback, all of that. It's very much in the heart and soul of what we do. Again, we're in the range of in that 325 to 350 customer range. And most of these are companies with over 5,000 employees. So it's everyone from Nordstrom to Walmart to Salesforce to, it really runs Elevance Health. It kind of runs the gamut in terms of industry. So we're doing quite well. We've been growing. We expect this next year we'll see a little bit more of a growth trajectory because we're moving into that pay consistency space and not focusing so much just on the pay equity, but really expanding to thinking about comp consistency and how companies can address that.
Got it. What I found really interesting about the software is, I see why it makes sense as, the kind of the beachhead into corporate America. Obviously, pay equity is this very discrete problem, very acute pain point. So it's very natural to find early adopters that want that problem solved and to make money and to grow doing that. But I've always thought of this kind of category is actually not specific to pay equity, but to me, this is like promise keeping software. That is, you're helping companies build an operational capability to stay true to the things that they value and to keep their promises. And I wonder, obviously your own team is not 5,000 employees yet. I would guess probably not. But how do you build that intentionality into your own team? How do you manage to make sure that you're a company that people would be very easy for them to hold you to a higher standard? Maybe even they would hold themselves to. You're the vendor. You're supposed to be the expert. How do you make sure that everybody on your team reflects the company's values and really takes that into consideration? Whether that's with nudges or accountability or just how do you think about that?
Yeah. And this is, we are not perfect. I think we do a lot of things that are the right things to do. But I think with a company like ours that's very purpose oriented, you have a lot of people coming to work for us that really care about the mission. And we still are a company that is a for-profit company. So we have to manage and hold people accountable for performance just like anyone else. And I think sometimes when you have to let someone go because of a performance issue, it's almost more difficult when you're a purpose-driven company like we are, because it's sort of well, what do you mean? I'm here to close the pay gap. How could you be letting me go? And you have to just consistently iterate and reiterate the same things, which are we care about performance. We're a high performance culture. You have to be very agile and nimble and adaptable to work in a growth stage company. We're 150 people and we have a lot of things that we're focused on, even though we try to be super, super particular about saying no. That's part of our culture. So I think those are difficult things when you find yourself in a company that people almost perceive you internally as a nonprofit because it's so purpose oriented, but you're not. And so people take it pretty hard. I think when you do have those accountability metrics in place, So that's one thing. The second thing is we do release internally and externally our pay gap and pay equity every year. So
Well,
I
I should hope
disclose
so.
our pay equity, our pay gap, our CEO pay ratio every year, regardless if it's getting better or worse. And I think that's really important because even on the years where we've taken a step back, the pay gap in particular, pay equity you can solve with money. That's you throw money at it, you close the gap. But the pay gap, again, that reflection of distribution and opportunity, we report on our promotion rates. We break that down in terms of who's getting promoted, how many promotions were internal, et cetera. But the pay gap, depending on what your levers are, you can really only make progress against it through hiring, promotion, and movement, and then obviously attrition. And so if, like during COVID, the first year of COVID, or just after when we were sort of seeing that tech realignment to profitability, we weren't really hiring except for engineers. And even though we do really well in our engineering balance of women and men, we were hiring engineers, and was mostly men. And so our pay gap sort of took a step back from the perspective of gender, but we improved for race. So it's those types of things. And I think being really consistent that even though we took a step back, we're still going to report it. We're still going to tell you what we look like. Those are the types of things that start to build trust over time. And then I think we've learned a lot, particularly over the last year. I think we were kind of crap at internal communication as we started moving from this Series C into this moment of really like employee headcount scale. We sort of, which is really ironic considering I'm a communicator, but we were sort of crap at communicating internally. Like, what are we focused on? What are our goals? How does that relate to what you should be working on? How do we make sure we're dishing out disappointment at a rate you can absorb? How do we make sure that we're focused? And I think over the past year, we've gotten a lot better at that. And it's really helped just make sure everyone's focused on moving in the same direction. I think internal comms is something that's critical. And, you can only wing it for so long before you have to start really like having a strategy as to how often are we going to communicate? How do we want to approach, sharing our goals, sharing our numbers, all of that kind of stuff.
Certainly the way you build trust. I mean, this, again, going back to the reservoir of trust, like you have to do things that are self-sacrificing and are not immediately in the company's interest in order for people to believe you when you say, when you say something else that is in the company's interest. If you only say those things, no one's going to believe. So I think being willing to report the numbers, even when they look quote unquote bad or they're not what you want them to be, that to me seems like just an essential step in building credibility. That's true, not just with this issue, but for any kind of disclosure. Being consistent about it and just being willing to tell the truth about where you're at seems so underrated.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Do you have a few more minutes? Can I ask you kind of a lightning round of a couple quick things? Okay, because this is one of my favorite things doing these interviews is getting to read the things that you've written and talked about elsewhere, and just there's a bunch of things I wanted to ask you about. Just what what were you thinking about when you said this? Is that all right?
Of course, someone's actually reading things I wrote. That's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. You said one very common piece of advice you give to people who want to start a startup is if you're a pessimist, don't do it. I just thought, that's so true. Tell me why.
Because you have to be so naive and optimistic about what can go right because so many things go wrong. And I just feel like, it was kind of like the CEO of NVIDIA said something similar where he was like, you just have to get up every day and sort of be like, I can't remember exactly what phrase he used, but something like, how hard can it be? And I really think you have to have that optimism in the face of just so much adversity because you can't make excuses. You can't have justifications. You just have to press on. And so seeing that sort of silver lining, I think is the way, particularly for early and mid-stage startups.
Yeah, the Eeyore types. It just one of the things I think is really interesting. I was talking to a company recently about this, that when you have a vision and you're committed to something, people sometimes get nervous about it, and they'll say like, "Oh no, but what if it doesn't work?" Or "Are you sure it's the right direction?" or something like that. Like that kind of this like pessimistic energy. And I was like, even if you have that question, it's kind of pointless because we are going to run the experiment one way or the other. So you're strapped in. This is much more like a roller coaster where you're locked in. We're going to do it.
Yeah.
So may as well be optimistic about it. May as well enjoy it because you're on the ride either way. And I think that's just, it's so underrated in startups to have that sense of positive momentum.
I agree. And momentum
even with the ups
is,
and downs.
don't you think in a startup in particular, like you can feel it when you're getting momentum and traction and your brand is getting picked up and customers are talking about you, like there's a energy to it.
Oh yeah.
And if you don't jump on that energy and start pushing as hard as you like as much energy as you have in you to push and to put the hours in at that moment, you miss it. And there are windows. Like what I really learned over the course of the last 7 years is there's these windows of just energy and momentum. And you have to all be pushing in the same direction with focus during those moments to capture them, because then they go away. And so it's just a really interesting ride from that perspective.
Amen to that. This one's a bit of a cliche, but it's very commonly misunderstood. And so I got to ask you, you were talking about, building your own network and finding the right people, to put around you as you build the company, so that a team of missionaries will beat a team of mercenaries every time. People say that they're going to do that when they build their company. And yet my experience is that most companies actually don't bother. Why is that so important? What did you mean by that? And like, how have you put that principle into action?
I personally think, that's what they did with me. They picked somebody that was going to have heart and soul and put every ounce of energy into creating this company and building something. And I think looking for builders, looking for people who actually want to create something. Like when I say missionary, that's more what I think about. It's how do you find a team of people that are so devoted, not just loyal, but devoted. Devotion is so different and such a deeper emotion than loyalty. They're devoted to making the idea a thing. They're devoted to making the company successful. And I think there's just nothing more important than that. The people that succeed at our company are the people that come in from any background and spend the time to understand what it is we do. And they listen to gong calls and they talk with customers and they learn how to demo. I'm talking about any role in the company. The ones that deeply understand what it is we do, those are the ones that succeed. And so I think that's part of that quote is like, who's going to come in with that type of tenacity to really want to learn and capture what it is the company does and then move that forward, move the ball.
You said that the strategies and tactics that got you to 10 million will not necessarily get you to 50 million, which that is one of my least favorite things about startups, is that at every stage, whatever you got you to that stage is almost not only not going to get you to the next stage, but almost like the diametrically opposite thing you need to do at the new stage. Talk about what that's been like as you've seen Syndio ascend through these different levels of scale. What are some examples of things that, they got you there, but couldn't get you to the next thing? Or what times when you had to help your team kind of come to understand that?
It's so difficult. It's the hardest thing. Because when you talk about being in the trenches, you're in the trenches with these people in the beginning. And if you get to the point where you're scaling beyond where someone can contribute in a way that they want to or can for where the company needs to go next, that's a really, really difficult conversation to have and difficult moment to part ways with someone that's been such a key contributor. And I hear this all the time from people who have co-founders and they part ways, or early employees that were so important to the 0 to 10, but can't necessarily or don't want to or don't fit with the 10 to 50 or 10 to 25. And I think you see this over and over again. And I think it's what contributes to this notion that CEOs, entrepreneurs of startups, like it does become lonely. And it's not lonely at first, because at first you're all in the trenches together. But as you start to scale, as people start to fall off, you start to realize, oh my goodness, like I don't necessarily know if I'm going to continue to scale, if this leader is going to continue to scale. So it's really up to me to just make sure I'm scaling and that I'm protecting the organism that is the company, and that everyone who's here is growing the organism that is the company. And that becomes the focus. And I think it's just so true. The habits, the culture, like our culture in the early days would not serve us now. Like we have to have a much more focused culture around accountability, performance, delivery, speed, customer quality, all of those things. And that's not necessarily the culture that we had in the beginning. So everything has to shift and morph. And if it doesn't, you're not going to make those scale leaps that are difficult just in themselves to move from 30 to 40 million. Like, that's a tough leap. And so if you're not making those changes in leadership, in culture, in your communication style, in taking those leaders. So I had a lot of leaders in the early days that were in seat with no experience, but that were absolute rock stars in terms of how they brought their experiences to bear. And some of those scaled up and some didn't. And so I think it's really tough. And then you constantly have to be asking the question of yourself, am I scaling? Am I scaling? Or is there someone that could do this job better than me in this moment? I think you have to be really honest with yourself and ask your board to be really honest with you. Because you want to do what's in the best service of the company.
Yeah, amen to that. All right, good time for one last one?
Yeah.
All right. I felt like we had to end with this one because I feel like I really appreciate the extent that you've been very candid and frankly vulnerable talking about what it's like being in tech. You talked a lot about what it's like to be the only woman in the room in a male-dominated industry. And you were talking about how when you were in that environment in some of your past experiences, you always felt this unintentional pressure to take less equity, to give up a seat at the table, to voluntarily take less pay. And of course, obviously, you're focused on pay equity. You can see now how those subtle changes compound over the course of a career. And I think, given that we are a male-dominated industry, there's a lot of people, who have never really experienced what you're talking about. And it's easy for this to become an abstraction, talk about this in political terms, policy terms. We started out talking about the way it's talked about in public. And I think we lose sight of the fact that these are actual real human beings who are having an actual experience. And I wonder if you'd be willing to just talk about what that was like. And how does it feel now to be kind of on the other side of it, where you've been able to build a team, that has a different philosophy and obviously to help so many of your customers to overcome that, unintentional pressure?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty remarkable journey to be able to be on and have experienced both sides. I think when I was younger and I was doing things like volunteering to give up my equity or my board seat or whatever, I didn't even realize I was doing it. And I think that's the most empowering thing about it, is that there's so much about just education that's important. And it's about educating your networks, your friends. I had one of our customers who's a very prominent CHRO. She was telling us a story about when someone cued her in early in her career to spot bonus. And she's like, they're like, ask for a spot bonus after this big and, heavy endeavor and work that she had put in. She's like, I didn't even know what that was. So there's a lot of just sort of education. And I think I feel very motivated to just kind of level the playing field with things like software, because it is agnostic and it does, again, draw that correlation between what do you say you value? How do you value people's contributions at work? At the end of the day, that is the most important thing. Let's value our contributions at work, and regardless of all the other crap. And I think that's what's been really important for me. The other thing is, like I said in the beginning, those 3 men that I mentioned that took a big chance on me, they're all white men. They're all old white men. So I just think you also have to keep your eyes open for the accomplices in the room that may not look the way that you think. You may think that you're looking at, for that woman that's going to be your next great mentor. But for me, these have been men that are not just allies, they are accomplices. They are back to back with me in the ring, fighting for the things that matter in terms of workplace fairness. And so I think also being open-minded and not having a victim mentality of like, there are good people around me that look like any size, shape, color, gender, and I just have to find them. And I have to be open-minded to the fact that they exist. I think that's also really important in this work.
Well, thank you for saying so. And thanks for taking the time to have this conversation. Thanks for all the work that you've been doing to address this, like what I think a lot of people have considered to be an intractable problem. And to me, I just have a special reference for people that show that the intractable problems are actually tractable. Doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, but it can be done. And I have a lot of confidence that we'll get to a world where this will seem archaic, and hopefully software can be the pathway to make that happen. So thanks for that.
Of course. Thank you so much for the conversation.
You've been listening to The Eric Ries Show. The Eric Ries Show is produced by Jordan Bornstein and Kiki Garthwaite. Research by Tom White and Melanie Rehack. Visual design by Reform Collective. Title theme by DB Music. I'm your host, Eric Ries. Thanks for listening and watching. See you next time.